So I'm going to talk to you a bit briefly about why postmodernism is wrong. And I actually mean technically wrong, apart from ethically wrong and morally wrong and intellectually wrong and emotionally wrong and practically wrong. But I'll give the devil his due to begin with, because they are actually wrestling with quite a difficult problem. And the founders of postmodernism were by no means unintelligent individuals. And they actually put their finger on quite an important problem. And the important problem that they put their finger on was the fact that any set of phenomena has a near infinite number of potential interpretations. And that actually happens to be the case. That fact, let's say, was discovered simultaneously in a number of different disciplines. One of them, most surprisingly, was artificial intelligence. And the artificial intelligence people ran into that conundrum when they learned that it was much more difficult to make a machine that could perceive the world than had originally been supposed. You know, we're supposed to have autonomous robots and functional artificial intelligence back by the late 60s, and of course that didn't happen. And part of the reason for that was that the artificial intelligence researchers, when they were starting to instantiate perception into their machines, learned that charting your course in the world might be a trivial problem in comparison to determining how to perceive the world. And the reason for that is that there's a very large number of ways to perceive the world. And the postmodernists actually cottoned on to this, and one of the claims they made was that, well, there's a near infinite number of ways to interpret any given text. And that actually also happens to be the case. And then they said, well, since there's a near infinite number of ways to interpret any text, how do you know that any given interpretation should take precedence over any other interpretation, which is also a perfectly reasonable issue. They went off the rails very rapidly after putting forward that set of propositions, and that's partly why they also kept their alliance with Marxism, because the problem with postmodernism fundamentally is that if you agree to the proposition that all interpretations of all phenomena are of equal value or lack of value, then you can't act in the world. And the problem with that is that if you're a human being, you have to act in the world, because otherwise you suffer miserably and then you die. And that seems to be an unacceptable outcome for most people. So the issue with postmodernism isn't so much the erroneous claim that there are a very large number of interpretations for any given phenomena, including the meaning of a text. The error in postmodernism is the failure to recognize that there are a finite number of credible interpretations of phenomena, and also a refusal to engage with the intellectual problem that determining what that finite set might actually consist of. And I'll just give you a very brief overview of how it is that we happen to solve this problem as human beings. We do it partly biologically, because we inhabit a biological framework that's been developed over the course of about 3.5 million years that severely constrains the manner in which we interpret the world, and it constrains it such that we tend to only spontaneously manifest interpretations of the world that don't result in undue suffering and our demise. And there's plenty of ways to be stupid enough to perish, and there's plenty of ways to be stupid enough to suffer without meaning, but there aren't very many ways to live properly and carefully for a long period of time in a manner that doesn't also simultaneously do harm to other people. And so that's the second set of constraints, is that you have biological constraints on your perception that are built in as a consequence of a Darwinian process. And the second part is that you're forced to interact with yourself now and this week, next week and the week after and the month after and the year after. So you have to conduct yourself in a way that doesn't interfere with your future life as you're living now, and simultaneously you have to conduct yourself in a way that makes all the other people around you want to cooperate with you and compete with you and maintain their relationship with you, and do that today and next week and next month and next year and so on into the future. So although there are a very large number of interpretations of the world, there are unbelievably severe constraints on the number of functional interpretations there are in the world. And one of the things that the humanities was supposed to be educating people with regards towards understanding was what the universe of those finite functional interpretations might be, and that's been more or less abandoned by the universities under the guise of postmodernism. The fact that the postmodernists dare to be Marxist is also something that I find, I would say, not so much intellectually reprehensible as morally repugnant. And one of the things that the postmodern neo-Marxists continually claim is that they have nothing but compassion for the downtrodden. And I would say that anybody with more than a cursory knowledge of 20th century history who dares to claim simultaneously that they have compassion for the downtrodden and that they're Marxists are revealing either an ignorance of history that's so astounding that it's actually a form of miracle, or a kind of or a kind of malevolence that's so reprehensible that it's almost unspeakable. Because we already ran the equity experiment over the course of the 20th century, and we already know what the Marxist doctrines have done for oppressed people all around the world, and the answer to that mostly was imprison them, enslave them, work them to death, or execute them. And as far as I can tell, that's not precisely commensurate with any message of compassion. And so I don't think that the postmodern neo-Marxists have a leg to stand on ethically or intellectually or emotionally. And I think that they should be gone after as hard as possible from an intellectual perspective, an informed intellectual perspective. And this is fundamentally a war of ideas. And that's the level of analysis that it should be fought upon. And not only is it a war of ideas, I think it's one that can be won, because I think that especially the French intellectual postmodernists are a pack of, what would you call them? Well, we could start with charlatans. That's a good one. Pseudo-intellectual would be good. Resentful would be another. And then I would also consider them they're highly deceptive in their intellectual strategies, because almost all of them were Marxist student intellectuals, and they knew by the time the Gulag Archipelago came out, and even before that, that the nightmares of the Soviet Union and Maoist China were of such magnitude that they had completely invalidated any claim to ethical justification that the fundamental Marxist doctrines had ever managed to manifest. And so it's a no-go zone as far as I'm concerned. Intellectually, the game's over. We've already figured out that there are finite constraints on interpretation, and we also understand why those exist and how they evolved. And from the perspective of political argumentation, there's absolutely no excuse whatsoever in the 21st century to put forth Marxist doctrines as if they're the bomb that's needed by the compassionate and the bomb that's administered by the compassionate to the downtrodden. Sorry, tried that, didn't work. We've got 100 million corpses to prove it, and that's plenty for me. And if it's not enough for you, well, then you should do some serious thinking, either about your historical knowledge or about your moral character. So that's the first thing.